Welcome to Lieven and Marcelo's Criminology podcast, a podcast hosted by Marcelo Aevi from the University of Lausanne, Switzerland, and Lieven Pauwels from Ghent University, Belgium. We aim to draw a map of the state of criminology across Europe through the words of contemporary criminologists. How is criminology defined and taught? Which are the main lines of research? Which are the main schools of thought in each country? These and many other questions are answered here by fellow researchers who share their vision on the development of criminology in their countries from its beginnings to the second decade of the 21st century. If you want to know and compare their stories, stay tuned.
Today we are interviewing Lesley McAra. Lesley McAra is Professor of Penology at Edinburgh Law School and also former Dean. She began her career as a researcher in the Scottish office where she led the major program of research evaluating social work criminal justice services. She is the co-director of the Edinburgh Longitudinal Youth in Transitions study together with Susan McVie. She was the organizer of the 2008 ESC conference in Edinburgh and a former president of the ESC board in 2020. This interview was conducted on the 28th of February 2023.
Welcome, Lesley McAra, to Lieven and Marcelo's Criminology podcast.
Thank you.
Welcome, Lesley McAra, to our podcast. We are very pleased that you're joining us today. So let me just start by asking you the first question we generally ask everybody, maybe one of the most difficult ones, but still an important one. From a comparative point of view, how would you define criminology as it exists in Scotland right now?
Right now. So I think it's actually quite difficult to say that there is a specifically Scottish criminology. One of the things that Alison Liebling, Shad Maroon and I sort of debated when we were editing the latest edition of the Oxford Handbook of Criminology was there even such a thing as British criminology? We think there probably isn't such a well-defined thing as British criminology, let alone Scottish criminology. I think Scotland has also been quite distinctive in its criminological development from the rest of the United Kingdom. We had the first chair was established in 1974 at Edinburgh, and that was the second one in the United Kingdom as a whole after Cambridge. And that was the mainstay of criminology for quite a long time. The other thing that's kind of interesting about the Scottish criminological tradition is that critical criminology had a bit more purchase in Scotland in terms of its influence on government policy than it ever did elsewhere. That many critical criminologists would never think of engaging with government at all, feel it was, not the thing that critical criminology should be. But within Scotland, we had a very radical person who was in charge of criminology within the Scottish office, as was Scottish Government, Scottish Office, as was then Jackie Toombs in the Central Research Unit there. And she used to commission quite a number of quite critical criminologists to do research. So people like Kit Carson, Jason Ditton, Richard Kinsey and others actually got contracts from the government and were doing research that was then drawn into Scottish policy, as was at the time. And the other thing that the Central Research Unit did is it incubated the careers of a number of people. Me, Susan McVie included, Michelle Berman included as well, and Alistair Henry at Edinburgh. We were all nurtured in this incubator that Jackie Toombs had. And I think that's a really important thing, that there was this critical criminological tradition that actually flowed a bit into policy. Criminology is really burgeoning in Scotland. There's a lot of it, but it's very difficult to say that there's one definition that would cover everything. And there's lots of methodological strength in all sorts of different areas, like there's quantitative criminology. So Susan and I in the Edinburgh study of youth transitions and crime are a sort of quantitative dimension to our study, although it is mixed methods. There's qualitative research on participatory methods. There's a lot of pioneering stuff being done on storytelling, using music, sensory criminology. So there's a burgeoning set of methodologies and a burgeoning set of works, but I wouldn't say there's something that you could say that would say this was Tartan criminology, so to speak.
Yeah, that is quite unique in Europe, because usually it was on the one side, many critical criminologists didn't want to participate, but also the governments were not interested in their views.
do you think this is something that has to do with the way in which Scotland in general is ruled as
structured?
Yes, yeah.
I think there's been quite a close relationship between the academy and government for a number of reasons. Well, certainly with policymakers, not necessarily politicians, because Scotland didn't have its own government, so to speak, until devolution in 1999. But there was this thing, the Scottish Office, which was a civil service and a quasi-autonomous part of sort of Westminster government. And many of the civil servants in the Scottish Office were actually quite progressive, more progressive than you might imagine. So and within Scotland being a small jurisdiction, lots of people were really well known to each other. So there are things like the Scottish Association for the Study of Offending, a SASO, which is an organisation that brings together the judiciary, it brings together senior government officials, it brings together senior academics and has conferences. And so people would know each other. There were very strong networks prior to devolution. And that kind of meant that people were talking to each other a lot, and that research ideas could flow into policy because of those kinds of conversations taking place. And I think that's one of the benefits of a smaller jurisdiction. And now with devolution in Scottish Parliament, there are lots of more ins to policy, in that you can talk to MSPs, you can get events at the Scottish Parliament. Often if you run a seminar with sponsored by an MSP, sometimes a minister will come in and sit at the back and listen in. And certainly some of the senior civil servants will. So there are lots of different kind of ways in which you can get influence, partly because it is a smaller jurisdiction. More recently, the Scottish Government has run a thing called the Scottish Justice Leaders Network, which actually slightly gone out into abeyance because of after COVID. It hasn't really re-energised, but before that brought together all the senior leaders of the institutions linked to justice, so the police, prison service, sentencers, academics, policymakers, and often the minister would come along to that, and they'd run events which could be showcasing research or could be talking about a particular policy area. And one of the sessions that we ran some time ago was based on the Edinburgh Study of Youth Transitions and Crime, and we ran one on what we call Doreen's story, which was a story of sort of life history, a life history of a case study within the cohort of somebody who was a crossover child who moved from juvenile justice into the criminal justice system and ended up in prison, and all the things that happened around that person's life. And we did it as a storytelling venture with the Scottish Storytelling Centre. And it had actually a really big effect on the people that were listening and helped to lead to certain kinds of policy change. So those kind of opportunities, I think, are things that I don't think always exist in England and Wales. And I know that when I talk to my colleagues south of the border, they often feel they're kind of quite envious of that kind of connection and that kind of contact that is possible. So there's a small jurisdictional aspect of it. I kind of sense that the civil service previously were quite progressive in the way in which they were thinking, and all of those things I think has led to a different kind of culture.
Small is beautiful,
as well sometimes.
the only similar case I can remember is Nils Christie in Norway, because I remember that once Elena Larrauri told me that 30 years ago, when she was a young scholar, or maybe still a student, no, she was already appointed, they called her from the airport in Barcelona saying there is a person here who says he's a professor of criminology and he has no passport. So she went there, and Nils said, you know, Norway is a small country, everybody knows me. So I went through you cannot imagine this nowadays, but I went through immigration and they didn't ask me for anything. So he landed without the passport. It's quite impossible to imagine. In the same line of this, the thing of knowing each other, did you manage to create a criminological society or a group that works like that? So,
I mean, can I just take one step back and then come back to that answer? Because I think when you say small is beautiful, small can also mean that things can change very rapidly. it's not always been the case. It has been this open door through to government, and there was a particular phase post-devolution when the first time we had this Scottish government, which was a Labour and Liberal Democratic coalition government, and they became much more punitive than the previous, which was a Conservative administration in Westminster, but with this progressive civil service that was semi-autonomous. They became much more punitive, and there was a short-lived phase in the early 2000s when things really did change a lot. There were new policies about fast-tracking, a big focus on persistent offenders, massive construction of new institutions to deal with the problem of crime. And it was part, I think, of what I've argued is a sort of part of capacity building on the part of a new government, which needed to do something and be seen to be acting. And of course, criminal justice is one of the ways they can do that. So you can see how in a small jurisdiction, although that can lead to lots of good relationships, it can also rapidly change very quickly. It's not clunky things that take forever to change. So you can sometimes get things that are more pernicious happening in those moments. And in fact, the Central Research Unit, which was, I think, one of the centre points of progressive thinking in criminology, that was disbanded in the early years of the new Labour and Liberal Democratic coalition government. And we ended up with, they got rid of that, stopped doing in-house research, and they got instead an analytical services, which then let contracts to survey companies rather than academics. So there was actually quite a big change at that point. But going back to your original question just now, there have been, one of the things that then emerged was, and actually funded by government, was the Scottish Centre for Crime and Justice Research. So there was money put into a specific centre in the sort of mid-2000s, which brought together several universities across Scotland, and it's Edinburgh, Glasgow, Stirling, Glasgow Caledonian at one point, and others into this centre, and they helped to support the development of a major doctoral programme, actually doctoral training and support, so a capacity building for earlier career scholars. And at its first phases did quite a lot of what we call ticketed work, where government would come and set a priority for research, and a small piece of research would be done in response to that. That aspect of it is slightly diminished, possibly as government's paying less money into it, and the universities have had to take over the support for it. But they did actually develop that kind of institute, and that's been great for Scottish criminology because there's a real critical mass now. And the other thing that the government did was to support the Scottish Institute for Policing Research, and Police Scotland in particular also supported this, and that has emerged as a unit for doing research on policing, very close to Scottish Police Service, but they have again built capacity through that, been able to support earlier career scholars, showcase work, and do work that has been commissioned by the police service. Now those kinds of structures are very good. They also come with risks. They come with risks where you are dependent on money from government or from the police, and that you are doing research that they're going to use. So there is a risk that you lose your critical friendship aspect. You've got to be a critical friend. So there's a risk that you become too close. So academics always have to be really careful about that. And it also risks that research agendas get too much set, not by the academics, but by the people who are commissioning the work. So we have to be careful about that. But I think in general, they've both been really positive initiatives for Scotland.
And you said that the Centre for Research, the one that existed before, was dismantled by the Labour Party, by the Labour government.
Well, it was the Labour Liberal Democratic Coalition Scottish government disbanded it. That was when it was disbanded in the early 2000s. And actually, roughly the same time as the Home Office Research Unit was also disbanded in its previous form. And both of those had, when I worked in the Scottish Central Research Unit, they commissioned research and we managed research. So I managed a big programme of research on social work, criminal justice, but it also did its own in-house research. So we were all doing research. We were active researchers. We were encouraged to publish work in refereed journals. So there was a real sort of academic sense of what that research was. And it did feel relatively independent. surprisingly, even though it was right within government, and that there were pieces of research done that were highly critical of policy that could still be listened to by ministers. And so there was a kind of influence that you could have at that point. Once you got rid of that, it became analytical services. You had more generalists, maybe data scientists working on data, big focus on data, and that kind of specialist knowledge, and the specialist knowledge of actually doing research yourself, rather than being an analyst and coming in and maybe swapping between different areas. I think that was lost. And the fact that they started commissioning survey companies to do research also led to a particular kind of research at that time being funded. So it wasn't, it just simply wasn't the same as before. And it was kind of quite flat, descriptive, not necessarily taking any kind of critical look at a particular policy or understanding the wider context. Yeah. So that was problematic. But with the development of the Scottish Crime Justice Research Centre, that kind of slightly counterbalanced that. Yeah.
I remember there was a discussion about the age of criminal responsibility. Yeah.
Yeah. Yes. Okay, this is a good one. So Scotland, it has had since 1971, when it was implemented, the Scottish Children's Hearing System, which is seen as an exemplar welfarist, benign system for young people who are both coming into conflict with the law, but also who are in need of care and protection. So it has a holistic approach, dealing with them both as children, with deeds being seen as symptomatic of deeper seated need. But even though they had that, the age of criminal responsibility in Scotland was 8. And it was 8 from about in the 1930s all the way through. And it only changed in 2019. There was an act passed which raised it to the giddy heights of 12. But even though 8 is obviously completely out of kilter with international norms, 12 is a little bit better. And that was quite a long time in the making. And one of the things that I have to say I'm deeply proud of, that the research that Susan McVie and I do on the Edinburgh study of youth transitions and crime, the Edinburgh study, that had a major influence in raising that age. And we are the only piece of research that is cited in the policy memorandum that accompanied the bill as it went through the Parliament. So the research that we've had an influence on that. But the actual change was much longer in the making, and it began with a subtle change in 2010, and this is for all the nerds here. There's a subtle change between raising the age of criminal prosecution to 12, but not the age of criminal responsibility. So they did it in stages. And at that point, they were also investing heavily in diversion from formal measures wherever possible, and early and effective intervention, trying to build up things from birth onwards that would be supportive of families and children and include school inclusion. And again, I'm also really proud that Susan and we also had an influence on the whole system approach, as it was called, which was this early and effective intervention and diversion that was rolled out across Scotland from 2011 onwards. So they raised the age of criminal prosecution. They then invested heavily in early years work, and they invested heavily in supporting children to remain in school, and they invested heavily in diversionary activities, although some of that investment has diminished in recent years because of austerity and the diminished amounts of money for public services, but they invested heavily in that. And what then happened was we had a major reduction in the number of young people who are coming into formal systems. So massive, I mean, really, these policies have had a huge effect. There's been a sort of 93% reduction in the number of criminal convictions for 16 and 17-year-olds, an 89% reduction in the number of children who are coming into the children's hearing system on offence grounds, and a 98% reduction in the number of young people aged 16 and 17 coming into custody, so being put into prison. So a massive change. And in fact, last week in Scotland, there's something like 9 children in custody who are under the age of 18. It's been an absolute massive reduction. So those reductions and the research evidence, and other pieces of research evidence too, obviously we weren't the only research that they drew on, but certainly for the raising of the age of the MACA, I think it gave the government confidence that they could actually raise it. So it took sort of 10 years for them to make the sort of the major step for it, because it was implemented in 2021. And now there is a review. It was embedded in the statute. There'll be a review of this in 3 years, with the idea that they might raise it still further to around about sort of 15. So Susan and I have been very heavily involved in this, both as advisors to subgroups on this, and also in sort of speaking to ministers about this and bringing our research to bear on that. So that's been an interesting journey, but 12 is still pitifully low, frankly. And it was interesting that they chose to raise the age of prosecution rather than the age of criminal responsibility. And what that meant in 2010 was children could still be referred to the children's hearing system on offence grounds from 8 to 12, and it would count as a conviction, a criminal conviction. If you were previously, if you were admitted to an offence, it counted as a conviction. The Act changed that and said you could still you couldn't be prosecuted in the criminal courts for anything, but you could still be in the children's hearing system on offence grounds. So that there was a sort of subtle distinction there. And very few children ever were referred to the courts. You could go to the court if you committed something really serious. I'm sorry, this is possibly a little bit too technical, all of this. If there was a very serious offence committed and you were previously over the age of 8, you could be prosecuted in the criminal courts, essentially the adult courts. But if so, by raising the age of prosecution, it meant nobody under the age of 12 would ever be in a criminal court, and in fact hardly anywhere anyway, so it didn't make much difference. But if you were over the age of 8 and were referred to the children's hearing system, that was still technically a criminal offence. Sorry, that is very complicated way of saying.
But it's, it's perfect. Yeah. And maybe that, as you mentioned now, the Edinburgh study, perhaps you could tell us a little bit about this study, how it was developed, how you got involved in it.
Okay, so it started in 1998, and David Smith of European Society of Criminology, is he and me. He was the principal applicant, I was a co-applicant. When we started it in 1998, and Susan came to work on the research project from, she and I were in Scottish Government, and I persuaded her to come to Edinburgh to work on the study, and she was a sort of main researcher within the project. And then when David retired in 2004, Susan and I kept it on, so we became we were always the co-directors, but I became the principal applicant for it. So we started in 1998. The cohort is 4,300 roughly of people who started secondary education in Edinburgh that year. So we've been following them. We follow them all through secondary education, and we've been having intermittent contact with the cohort over that since then. The most recent sweep was when age 35, and that happened right in the middle of COVID. So it was very difficult doing the fieldwork at that point. We have criminal conviction data for the whole cohort right up to age 34. We've got social work and children's hearings records from birth up to 18. We've got police juvenile liaison officer records in the teenage years. We've got school records. So we've got a multiplicity of information about the cohort, both from administrative data and also from their own self-reports. And we've also got interview data at various points as well. So at the most recent sweep, we've got a sweep of self-report data, but we've also got in-depth interviews with around about 80 members of the cohort who'd had criminal justice experience of some sort, including, and we're trying still to do some interviewing for those who are in prison and have our prison experience, so we're still following up on that a little bit. So that's been the study, and yes, so it's been going for a long time. It's difficult to get longitudinal studies funded. The funders love them, and actually policymakers love them too. Funders love them for the first few years, but then it's much more difficult, but they don't fund them longitudinally. It's difficult to get funding all the time. And actually, that's one of the great successes, I think, of David Farrington's Cambridge study, the Western Farrington, then the Farrington study, that he has managed to get funding for it. I mean, obviously, I imagine it too, it's been difficult at times, but he's managed over a much longer period. We're really grateful to the Economic and Social Research Council, funded us in the early years. Scottish Government's given us money from time to time, and the Nuffield Foundation has been our greatest supporter. So they've been absolutely terrific. So our charity has been terrific, and that's because they are very appreciative of the kind of policy impact that the studies had. And we still continue to have impact on other bits of government policy, such as knife crime and violence. We're involved, you know, we've been cited within that too. So it's had, and elsewhere too, we're involved in, we just published an article on the ethical and empirical case for raising the age of criminal responsibility, and it's been published in an Australian journal where there's that sort of active campaign to get ages of criminal responsibility changed there too. So we're, and in Ireland. So we're kind of active around the world as well in terms of the kind of policy, applied policy impact that we may have. So yeah.
Yeah, What worries me also with these studies, also it's difficult to get the funding during the study, and also like the next generation. For example, David Farrington's study. Okay, they must be 70 now, but there is no second wave. There is, or at least to my knowledge, nobody has taken another cohort. Huh?
Well, I think there's something to be said about where criminology is at the moment in terms of its methodological and theoretical concerns, which I think shift quite a lot over time, sometimes looping back to things of earlier concern. So that's one thing. But I would also say that there are some studies happening in the UK which will have a crime dimension, even if they're not actually purely criminological in intention. So some of the Millennium studies cohort studies will have questions about crime in. But in Scotland, there's been this study called Growing Up in Scotland, which has taken sequential cohorts, a couple of cohorts of children, and followed them through. And we've had some of our questions put into that survey, same questions as the Edinburgh study about crime 20 years later. And what we're finding there, and that's not quite the same thing because it's a national cohort, it's not focused on Edinburgh, and so we have a population, theirs is a sample, and so it's slightly different methodologically, so you've got to be careful about comparisons. But what we found with the same questions is quite a major change in terms of, so crime's gone down dramatically. It's 5% lower in the Growing Up in Scotland cohort than it was in the Edinburgh study cohort. There was a shift of for age 14. We had 74% of the our cohort admitting to some of the most of the offences that we had, at least one of them that we were surveying on at that point. And in the Growing Up in Scotland one with the same question, it was only 33% admitted to one of those. So there's been a shift in maybe in the nature of offending or the location of offending, but it means that the kinds of things that we were measuring, they don't seem to be so prevalent now. So there are some studies that are around that, that are looking a little bit at crime, but not necessarily a sort of a cohort study in the same way that we have, or the Cambridge study has, or the Peterborough study either as well, PADS. So that I do agree with that. I think in terms of the younger generation, I think it's very interesting to see how, I don't know, how criminology has become very specialised, and how there are loads of journals now and hundreds of handbooks on different sorts of things, and there's a kind of fashion for certain kind of methodologies that come through. So, and there are things like sensory criminology and hauntology now emerging within criminology. And for some, I think that sort of developmental work seems slightly old-fashioned, maybe, and sort of traditional. I don't know, and I know that that developmental criminology and critical criminology have not always been very happy bedfellows, so to speak. But I think it's not necessarily quite that, say, I actually want to start a longitudinal study. I'm not certain that many earlier career scholars would be thinking in that kind of way at all. And because it's such a tough gig in terms of getting funding for it, it is, and because the results of it aren't absolutely known. I mean, we're now seeing, we've got really interesting findings from the latest phase about people reflecting back on their lives and able to think about the pathways into and out of offending, and pathways into and out of a sort of criminal justice career, which is not always completely coterminous with a criminal career. That the findings now are really interesting in a way that you've got to wait, well, quite a long time for that. So again, if you're building your career, sometimes you need quick, publications, and there's also a bit of a break on that kind of thinking. And I don't know that people are that familiar, because of the specialisation, that people tend to not then be seeing things in the round in a sort of general way. I don't know. I think it's an interesting question.
So there are two things that you are developing there. One is the fragmentation of criminology because of this specialization. We can go to that a little bit later, because the other thing interesting is the change in crime, which surely is related somehow to lifestyles of adolescents. What I've seen in Switzerland for almost 5 years now, but the pandemic changed a little bit the distribution, is that the age crime curve it's not being repeated as it used to be. And then I read this year, well, now we're in 2024 already, but a couple of months ago, I read an article in the European Journal about, I think it was England and Wales, also about changes in the age crime curve. And as you're all the time studying this, among the many things you do, one is juvenile delinquency.
Yeah.
Have you seen this phenomena too?
Yeah. Well, I mean, I think that the difference between the Growing Up in Scotland survey and the Edinburgh study suggests that something slightly different about whatever age crime curve there is, and it might be a bit flatter rather than as peaked as before. But I think one of the really intriguing things, if in Scotland, if you look at the criminal convictions as a measure of the age crime curve, and that's often what people are looking at, they're not looking at self-reports, they're looking at conviction data. We have seen a major shift from when our cohort were in the early teenage years, so in the early 2000s, the median age of conviction in Scotland was between 18 and 20. It's now between 31 and 40. So it's gone up. Now, what's interesting about that for us, and we're going to be able to test this, I think, hopefully with data, what we think is happening here is that the group of people who were coming to their formative age in their teenage years, where it's most likely to be the peak age of rule breaking, they came to that age at the most punitive time in Scottish policy, where there was fast tracking, much more punitive approaches. And as they have aged, so has the median age of conviction gone up in Scotland. So we think it's a longer term effect of having had a punitive interventions in the teenage years, and that has had a longer term effect. And so it's exacerbated the risks of criminal conviction. Because one of the findings we have from the study is that that even early offending and early criminal justice experience are both predicted by earlier criminal justice experience or earlier agency intervention. There's a kind of an unvirtuous circle there, that the earlier you have involvement with formal agencies, the more likely you're to continue with that and the more likely your offendings to be exacerbated. And we think that's happened with the Edinburgh cohort, who are now in the median age of conviction now in Scotland and have been all the way through as it's gone up. Conversely, the children and young people who are coming through in the sort of 2000s, from 2010 onwards, they have had a much more benign, in a sense, of more early effective intervention and more diversion, and consequently the criminal convictions, everything is going down for them. And if you look at crime survey data in Scotland and also in England, in some of and this is not perfect measure, but in some of the questions they ask victims is about the age of the perpetrator. And what you see from the age of perpetrator, looking at trends over time, for 16 and under or under 24, it's all gone down, and the age of the perpetrator that people are reporting as the age of the perpetrator has actually gone up in the over 25s. And that is, again, another piece of evidence about change. Now, one of the things that we can do in the study, we've just got the data now, is we're going to test this out, whether there's a what we might call a policy period effect within criminal convictions. So this offender index is everybody in Scotland who's got a conviction, but over time. So we can pick out cohorts of different birth cohorts within that data. So we're going to take a cohort that was born before the Edinburgh study, when their formative years were when it was a more benign system in the sort of before pre-devolution children's hearing system, when they were in the formative years. And then we're going to look at a national cohort that were born at the same time as our cohort. So 1986 onwards, that's when they were born. And then we're going to take as latent cohort as we can to get sufficient data born after, whose formative years were in, so when it was less punitive in Scotland. And we're going to model the trajectories there and see whether there are differences in those trajectories over those time points. And if there are, we would hypothesize that there will be, but if that hypothesis is founded, it will demonstrate a policy period effect and maybe demonstrate actually empirically how labelling functions to exacerbate criminal conviction data. So that's where we are. We're just about to do that analysis, and we hope we've just got the data now.
Yeah, that sounds very interesting, because that's a subject that has been discussed for a long time, but it is very rare that you get real longitudinal data to test the effect of labelling. That's always been a weak point of testing the empirical implications of labeling, and you really need these panel data. And if you have different cohorts, This is absolutely a must to control for indeed policy effects. Another thing I was wondering, because nowadays young people commit different kinds of crime, and there is the influence of the internet that might also intervene with, of course, the detectability of crimes, things that go on online. So that might also, interfere with the other hypothesis you have.
I know that's what. Yes, there's sort of confounding effects of the changing location of crime. Exactly. I think and we have to think about how we'll manage that within the analysis. I completely agree. I mean, one of the things Susan and I were exploring in something we published in 2019 was why crime seemed to be going down amongst young people, essentially. And one of the apart from the diversion that actually is happening, a lot of diversionary policies were being implemented across Europe. And you could see then that convictions for young people would go down in many jurisdictions, because often when people are talking about the crime drop, they're not talking about self-report data necessarily. Often it's to do with official data. But what we did think was also happening was that crime would be shifting online, and therefore some of the crimes that were committed by the kids in our cohort were hanging around the streets and getting involved in public order offences, or graffiti or vandalism and being out, or even sort of more lesser antisocial behaviour rather than something that was criminal. That sort of behaviour is completely shifted because it's a secular change as people have been, more at home and playing on computer games, etc. And that consequently, things like cyberbullying and cyber offences amongst children, young people have almost definitely supplanted some of that earlier behaviours and some of that, some of the more street-based behaviours before. So it may very well be that young people are not necessarily really involved in less crime. It's just the nature of the crime and the rule breaking has shifted because culture and the secular change and social changes meant that there's a different location for it. And so I think it'd be really interesting to see the research as it comes through now about looking at that kind of behaviour and whether that maybe accounts for it. So maybe there's less of a crime drop than people think. So I think that would be very interesting to explore more. And we certainly, Susan and I, were concluding that was probably the case from the data that we were able to get to show the shifting and shifts in behaviour.
Yeah, there are two effects there that are interesting. One is the kind of activities have changed, and so the kind of let's say deviant or criminal activities have changed. But also the way in which time is spent has changed completely. I already saw it with my daughter, who is now 25. Yeah, they had 10 years ago, they had already a WhatsApp group or whatever system. So they didn't have to meet. I remember meeting with the groups I had to work. So the time we spent outside, usually we used to measure unstructured and unsupervised activities, mainly by time spent in the streets, but now more unstructured and unsupervised than the internet you cannot find. But that changed a lot. So I think these comparisons will be extremely useful.
I think the other thing that we also will be interesting to explore the longer term impacts of the COVID-19 lockdowns. So I was involved in a research project with one of the government commissioned some rapid research to be done on the impact on various ways of the COVID lockdowns. And I was involved in a study on schools, well, not being in school. It was called In Isolation and Not in School, INIS, the INIS study. And we did a survey of about 800 Scottish school pupils from age 14 to about 18. And we also did some focus groups with them as well. We had 45 people that were involved in focus groups. And what was very striking, as you might expect, but what was striking was that massive rise in mental health issues and the depression. And we use clinical measures, and people with moderate to severe clinical levels of depression, clinical levels of anxiety. And also we used a screening test for post-traumatic stress disorder. And the depression and the anxiety was absolutely, I mean, more than for depression, almost 6 times higher than it was pre-pandemic, and anxiety was very elevated. Post-traumatic stress disorders, a lot of people that screen for that, it's difficult, so there's no national data on post-traumatic stress disorder, but it seemed quite elevated. And what we know from the Edinburgh study, when we look at people aged 35 who are still involved in violence, there's actually there's an anterior history of mental health issues and of actually adult trauma. And when we looked at the in our Edinburgh study, we also asked about COVID-19, the impacts on mental health, and again, deleterious impacts of it. And what we might be seeing within this generation of young people that are coming through is there is a greater risk then of violence and self-harm, because that's predicted by this elevated sense of non-mental health well-being, so to speak, that there could be a sort of time bombshell in terms of violence, and it's not just to others, it's to self as well. So I think we've got a generation, and we see it, the youngsters coming through into university, we see it in other behaviours, and adult behaviours also have slightly changed in social settings as a consequence post-pandemic. So I think there's something really interesting about seeing whether behaviour changes, and also what kind of things we do to support young people, because there's obviously a really need for adolescent mental health services to be much more accessible and much more support, and also for us to be much more supportive of the young people that are moving into adulthood now, because they have actually had a very traumatic time, even though it feels quite a short period for lockdown, in context of someone's life. It's almost we've seen very dramatic effects, and it'll be interesting to see what the behavioural consequences of those will be.
And if I remember correctly, you also had measures of drug consumption, because that is also a major change that we have seen. For example, in the 1990s in Switzerland, at the peak of the heroin consumption, 1994, when the heroin prescription program started, we had something like 400 deaths by overdoses. Yeah. And at that time, there were, let's say, 70 homicides per year. And this, with the heroin prescription programs, went down, and now it's, let's say, 100, and we have 50 homicides per year. So it's still the double, but not as much as at that time. But what I saw couple of months ago, I was watching at the data of overdoses, death by overdoses, which is always it's not the best word, overdose, but that's a bad use of drugs. Is that the generation that is dying now are people who are in their 50s or more. It's still the generation that used to consume heroin, at that time. Yeah. And when you look at the figures for 1992, 93, 94, this period, it was young people. But now, of course, there are some young people dying, but still this old generation. And this is something that maybe you have measures of that probably, yeah?
We do in the study. And actually, one of the things from this most recent phase, particularly from the interview data, although, it was the self-report data that backs this up, but from the interview data is just for this cohort, taking drugs is just normal. It's normal, like totally normalized. A lot of it was in the sort of from early experimentation, and it was associated in the early teenage years with kids that get involved in more serious forms of offending were also experimenting with drugs, so early drug use is very much associated with that. But as they got older, it's much more common, and it became recreational in sort of 17, 18, 19, 20 and beyond, that people were they were taking drugs, they were going out as part of the deal. And many of the people who were still involved in offending in their 30s, they were mostly drug users and quite vulnerable individuals. Actually, the ones who were most involved in the most serious offending at that age were vulnerable in all sorts of ways, and drug taking was more common there. Not very many people injecting drugs, but a lot of cocaine. That seemed to be the drug of choice, mostly in smoking, marijuana, also just completely normalized. So I thought that was interesting. One thing that one of the cohorts said I thought was really telling, that they had decided to try and move away from had a very difficult life, move away from offending, and one of the things that had triggered this sort of a sort of moment of enlightenment was that they went to work in a bar, but this bar was in a very much more affluent area of Edinburgh than they lived in. And they said, oh, we saw lots of people having a really great time, families together, but people getting really drunk, but there was no fighting and there was none of this. And I suddenly thought, oh, this is how it's meant to be, they said. And I thought that was really interesting, that you could go to the pub, you out your face, but you didn't fight, and actually you could have a good time without actually fighting. And I thought that was made me smile.
Well, I think that was very informative about youth crime. And the other thing that you mentioned is the specialization in different fields of criminology that leads to a fragmentation of the discipline. If you look, you're a former president of the European Society of Criminology. You remember the working groups that we approved at that time, and now there are almost 40 working groups. Yeah. And a phenomenon in Florence is that you had the biggest conference of the ESC, 2,500 people, but less people in the plenaries than we used to have in smaller conferences. And many people in their own working groups, we try to put the working groups in the same room during the day, and maybe this contributes to this fragmentation of the discipline. How do you see this phenomenon?
So I mean, I do think there's a fragmentation. I think there's lots of specialism, and I mean, it's completely evidenced by Shad, Alice, and I counted up the number of handbooks for when our introductory chapter for the Oxford Handbook. I mean, I don't know how many we got to, but there's a lot. There used to just be one Oxford Handbook of Criminology. There's now a lot, and so there's this. So what there are, I think, in some level, having a massive conference and having so much energy and lots of different specialisms that people are passionate about, that has to be a good thing. And I think criminology continues to speak to some of the biggest challenges the world faces. We have, I mean, one thing about our discipline, if we call it a discipline, is that it speaks to so many of the important, there's something criminological about many of the things, such as, climate change and green criminology, some of the things about migration, geopolitical tensions that are occurring. There's a criminological angle to quite a lot of that. So I think we are hugely relevant. So there's the burgeoning of criminology, maybe something in one level to be really celebrated. But the risk of all of that is that we all become caught into little silos or little kind of particular, we're all running on parallel train tracks and we're not listening to each other. And I think it's really important that that when you are in a particular group, that you don't then, what's the word? I don't want to say disrespect, but you have respect for other perspectives. There's a risk that people are not listening to each other, and therefore, and so the value that bringing the interdisciplinarity and the cross-disciplinarity and the different kinds of knowledge that we have, if we don't ever think about it in the round, in the whole, then I think we lose something, and I think that's a problem. I think there'll be probably fewer people in Bucharest than there were in Florence. I think Florence was a particular moment because it was relatively easy to get to and a beautiful location. And although Bucharest is also a beautiful location, it's a bit further away. And it may be a slightly smaller conference this year. Smaller conferences have the benefit of, I don't know, a sense of group identity. When it's enormous, it's very difficult to get that. So it may just have been a victim of its own success in a way. Although it was lovely to be in the gardens of the venue and having drinks on the first night. It's just lovely. That's always the best bit of the conference, I think, at the beginning, when you're meeting your old friends again and you're all there for a drink and it's warm and it's lovely. I think sometimes the most successful conferences also are where you're not in the middle of a city, which is beautiful, and you want to go off and see the city and people disperse. So when we were in Liège, which I think was one of my favourite conferences, we were in the university, which was slightly away from the town, and everybody stayed together. I think another example was Edinburgh, even though we didn't really want to be in the rugby stadium. We tried to get the university book, but it was too late. But being in the rugby stadium, we were all together and it had an identity and a shape. So I think when you're in a big city, and I think that also may happen in Bucharest, a big city that's, the people will then disperse a bit to go and explore. So those are things that I think make a difference. So I think on one level, I think the burgeoning of criminology and how people are excited by it and how many young people want to study criminology, that's terrific. But I think we just got to be careful we don't lose our identity as a nology, so to speak. I don't want to call us a discipline because I don't know that we are a discipline necessarily, but as a nology. I think that would be a shame. And I think it's important that people read work that's not necessarily in their own specialist area. I think that's very important. It's very important for intellectual development that you always, I think, sometimes get the biggest leaps in knowledge when you're encountering something completely different that makes you think differently about something. And if you only talk to people who agree with you, that's not going to make much change. So I think that's one of the risks as well of people becoming too siloed in certain ways, in certain specialisms.
I would say I completely agree, but there is a big challenge there because somehow you can't escape specialization because knowledge grows. But on the other hand, you also want things to be multidisciplinary, but people just keep talking in their own jargon. And if you let people just talk within their own silos, you will never get to understand each other's jargon. And sometimes you talk about the same things, but use a different concept framework. And then you think you are talking about different things, but basically you're not. So this is, in my view, really a challenging thing for, European criminology or criminology as a scientific discipline as a whole. Personally, I see it as a field, but a scientific field, of course. But this is the major challenge because specialization is going on everywhere.
Yeah. In terms of specialization and interdisciplinarity, it's not a discipline. I agree with you. I don't think we can call it a discipline. And I think a field is a good way of describing it. But I think that interdisciplinarity is more than just disciplines coming together. There's something about a fusion or a synthesis or something. And that, I think, some of the most exciting criminology is where there is that genuine interdisciplinarity happening. So it's not multidisciplinarity. There's something more than the sum of its parts. And you won't get to that if people are not genuinely open to coming together. And if you split up into specialisms, you'll never get that. So you'll get different disciplines within disciplines, so to speak. So I think there's something about that magic moment of synthesis and theoretical imagination that comes from more than the sum of its parts. And I think those are the sorts of things we should be pursuing. One of the things I think that we can also see across criminology is the major focus on criminal justice and institutional analysis, and less development of theories about crime. Actually, I think that theorizing about crime is less popular if you look across everything that's available, and specialism and courses, for example, that exist. That understanding causes of crime stuff is less fashionable at the moment than criminal justice, and people are very excited by engaging with criminal justice systems and with when people come to want to do criminology in the UK, it's often because they've seen what formerly used to be The Bill or some other kind of popular television programme about, or forensic, a silent witness, a sort of forensic study. That's what they think they're coming in to study. That sort of animates them. But causes of crime, people are, I think, less interested in just now. I think that's slightly, as I said earlier, I think developmental criminology is seen as less fashionable. And I think there are fashions and things that people go with. And yeah, I think we lose something if we don't stick sometimes also to the traditions as well. Some of the sort of traditional criminology and some of the theories that we have from the 60s. Susan and I are great fans of labelling theory, obviously, and some of the sociology of deviance. It's not, remember Colin Sumner writing about the sociology of deviance is dead. I don't agree. I think it's very much alive, but I think people are generally not wanting to research the causes of crime. That may be an overgeneralization, but I do see it as being seen as a bit old-fashioned, unfortunately.
Yeah, well, in Belgium, I have the impression that people mostly are interested also in the study of the societal reaction, but I think just the life course perspective just shows that both perspectives go hand in hand, because
exactly.
You cannot develop without coming into contact with some system, and that also involves your it sets out future pathways. So, and that's, I think, one of the strengths of the Edinburgh study. You can actually combine traditions.
Yeah.
Developmental and life course criminology is not just a theory. It's not just one way of looking at it. It's just an umbrella which makes the integration of different perspectives possible. So I think this is an interesting thing for the future, because I agree specialization is interesting, but if you have these giant frameworks, things may become even more interesting. Like you talk about labeling theory, and I think in other disciplines, people just use different names. In social psychology, for example, people look at intergroup processes and outgroup, in-group processes, ostracism. It's the same thing. They just don't use the word labeling, but they're studying the same thing.
Yeah.
So sometimes I think we really need to think about how we can learn from other disciplines and avoid talking, not to each other, but integrating things and taking it a step further. So I'm really looking forward to the publications which you are planning on the results, the latest results of the study. If you can elaborate on this.
Susan and I are working on a book just now, which is going to be the book of the study, and a kind of at the heart of that will be looking at criminal conviction careers and criminal careers, and looking at factors that predict them and pathways into and out of being involved in criminal justice systems, and pathways into and out of being involved in offending, criminal, actual offending. So that's what we're working on just now, based around our theory of negotiated orders, which we first published on actually some time ago in 2012. But we've just been publishing on the age of criminal responsibility, and what our findings are demonstrating about the need for change there. And we're also publishing on the relationship between crime and inequality as well at the moment. So looking at criminal offending careers over the sort of teenage years, and looking at the early antecedents of that, which our study is showing is early experience of trauma, early being brought up in the context of poverty, and having contact with agencies from a very early stage. There's a kind of labelling effect, stigmatizing effect that's going on. So we're writing, hopefully it's a chapter in a book at the moment, and a journal article, and the journal article's been published. The chapter in the book hasn't yet quite been published, and those will form the sort of basis of some of the things we're going to say in our book. So yes, we're working hard on that. The interview, one of the really interesting conundrum that we have to work through with the findings now is that what we see in the quantitative data, very, very strong labelling effects, both in terms of your criminal career and also your criminal conviction career, the very strong effects of that. But when you talk to people about at age 35, and you talk to them about their lives and their criminal justice careers and their offending careers, and what helps them move out of offending, what's very interesting is that the criminal justice system doesn't feature really in the narratives at all, very rarely, other than the people who are in prison. And the criminal justice system has a huge effect on their lives. Obviously, the most prison experienced are the ones who've had most difficulty actually in moving away from offending. Inevitably, but for the others in the cohort, that they are telling us they don't talk about the criminal justice system. It's all to do with things like relationships, having a job, children, this going home, clean, dirty hands. Somebody said, "Going home, dirty hands, clean money." It was a great quote. That they had, they had a job, and they got dirty hands for the job, but it was clean money and going home in the concept of home. It's such a lovely way of putting it. That all of those things were deeply important. Equally, others sort of trying to shrug off their previous identity, and even though they've been involved in a lot of offending, not saying, "Oh, well, I didn't," downplaying it, minimising it, a bit like Matz's neutralisation techniques, talking about it in that kind of way. But the criminal justice system didn't seem to impact their lives, and it seemed to be just a hazard to be negotiated. It wasn't the central part of their life. So when they were first involved with the criminal justice system, it was a bit scary, they said, in the teenage years, but after that, completely normalised and actually didn't affect. So if labelling and stigma is so important in terms of driving the conviction trajectories and offending trajectories, yet people are not talking about it in that way, what does that then mean from labelling a theory and about your identity? So that's a conundrum that we are kind of working with just now. The prison experienced people actually are really aware of the labelling effects. and one of them talked about, one of the people who were in prison talked about that the police had a special drawer for them where they just kept all stuff, and the minute they got out of prison, they'd open the drawer and pull out something else. And they could never, ever break the cycle because the police were always going to be back at them, and that they were sort of, they couldn't escape from the labels that had been attached to them, and it was a proud part of their identity. So for the most prison experience, it was very evident that they were conscious of what was happening to them. But for the others, they didn't really talk about it in that way. And that's something that we're going to be just thinking about what that might mean and how we understand that, because there definitely have been effects of labelling in their lives and their trajectories, but they don't consciously talk about them.
Maybe there are some other label effects that are less taken into account, namely society as a whole, because who is going to offer a job to somebody who leaves prison? I mean, so as a society, we obviously sometimes want to protect ourselves. So it's not just the institutions, but also...
Yeah, true. But this effect of then having the criminal conviction that then has that effect on, that labels you as a criminal, that then makes all the opportunities that you could have are completely cut down and diminished. So it sets us out path dependency for somebody, because they can't escape from that, from those things that would enable them. So getting a job would be impacted by having involvement with the criminal justice system. So it's true that does, the sort of wider things do, but it's because you've had the criminal conviction. So it's interesting. Anyway, we're just so grateful to the cohort who stuck with the study. I mean, if you work with longitudinally, they get used to being surveyed, and we weren't able to survey the whole cohort this time. We got all the criminal conviction data, but we haven't been able to get the self-report data from everybody. We got, I don't know, around about a quarter of the cohort, because it was COVID and we had to do everything online. You had to pivot online. And if you're doing this kind of study, there's a diaspora, so therefore, lots of them don't live in Edinburgh anymore, but they were the ones who were more likely to get, because we could interview them easily electronically. But many of the ones in Edinburgh who'd remained, and some of the young people who were most vulnerable and most involved in offending did remain in Edinburgh. So we knew where they were, but we couldn't get to interview them because we couldn't go out and knock on doors or meet them in the cafe, and trying to do it online. It's very interesting about response rates to interviews online. We think it's very much easier to just opt out of something by not turning up online than if you arrange to meet somebody somewhere. They often actually turn up. Whereas if you're doing it online, it's easy to just say, oh, I can't be bothered, and don't turn up. So it was quite a lot of effort to get people to actually take part in the interviews, and we had to kind of work very carefully with them, but we couldn't go and knock on doors. So we didn't get quite such a big response rate to the self-report bit. But that was the COVID effect.
But anyway, I mean, that's the challenge of longitudinal research in general. I mean, it's still surprising that you still can get this huge group of people. I mean, following people over so many years. I mean, it's quite exceptional in Europe. I mean, if I look at the Belgian context, it's hard to see anything that goes beyond a two-way panel study. I mean, and that's basically also because of course, government not willing to invest, or the prices are just too high for these studies, and they want immediate return. So I think
we've tried to keep in touch with the cohort as best we can with the money that we've had. And I think one of the things that so you get to know them, and they get to know the study. They know the study exists. And we know from much of the feedback we've had from cohort members who have given it to us is that they feel quite proud that the study's made a difference to the lives of people, and they feel that their experiences have flowed into thinking about policy, which has changed for the better the lives of young people. And I think they feel, the ones that have given us feedback, feel very proud of that and want to continue to be involved with the study because they feel it's made a difference to young people, and maybe not to them, but to other people. And I think that's just a lovely thing. So there's a kind of Edinburgh study, I don't know, a feeling of being in a cohort and of being something rather special for some of them, not everybody obviously, but for some of them. And I think that's a lovely thing. We probably want to try and keep going, depending if we ever get any more money. I think we're definitely going to try and keep going with the prison interviews just now. We're very grateful to the Scottish Prison Service for allowing us access to do the interviews. And we may think about further interviews. It probably will become more qualitative, but we have permission to get criminal conviction data in perpetuity. So until somebody withdraws their consent from it. So we will be able to keep the whole cohort in criminal conviction history, and that will be interesting, doing that again over time, doing another sweep at that. But we might focus a bit more on some of the more qualitative stuff, and taking people who've been justice experienced and re-interviewing them at various time points. I think it will be interesting.
Now, one thing that you also mentioned is that people talk about relationships and their relationships. And I think that romantic relationships is one of the most underrepresented topic of study, because when you think about the time people spend thinking about and doing things and connecting to apps nowadays in romantic relationships, in their life, it occupies a lot of space, and this is not reflected in our work. I've seen dating as a risk factor in some American research, and having sexual relationships also as a risk factor. What do you think about it?
Well, Samson and Lau did in their study, really looking at the GLUX data, they did say that, you know, that there could be a turning point was having a relationship. So, and actually we have definitely found that in the study, that people, when they're talking about pathways out of offending, that relationships really matter in that. And it's not just with partners, it's also with children too. It's both, it's the both things together, or having a partner. And I think that really makes a difference. I mean, whereas partners can be, and they also talked about in their earlier years how certain partners could actually draw them into crime, but partners are also significant in terms of moving out of crime. And so I think we've got strong evidence for that. So it depends, I suppose, on the context. But generally speaking, you know, if you have a settled relationship, there's something about that there's the importance of it is, and it's often when they were talking about it in their what we're calling early middle age in the 30s. I don't think people in their 30s will be pleased with that. We're calling it early middle age. When they're talking about it, is as if they talk about it as if it's such a precious thing and they couldn't bear for it to be damaged. They couldn't bear for children to be taken away. They couldn't bear for their relationship to break down. They see it as something really precious and value it in a way that it wasn't taken for granted. And I think that was very telling. I think that the preciousness of these close relations, how earlier lives they had very disrupted relationships, lots of violence in families were described, and now they've got this precious thing that they don't want to destroy, and they think that they're, you know, how their behaviour, and a lot of them talked about the precarity of it, in the sense that not that the relationship was precarious, but the sense of well-being or happiness or being in a good place was precarious, and that, you know, that you felt for quite a number of them that just one little thing going wrong and quite a lot of it would all fall apart. So there was a sort of sense of precarity, but also a sense of joy in these relationships that were really deeply precious, that they did not want to destroy. I thought it was some very moving things that were said to us. They're very, very important. And having a jobs too, you know, having money is another thing. Money and a job, really important.
Just thinking out of the box, what I think would be very interesting for the future would be if you could be able somehow to monitor the development of some of the children of the people you're following.
Oh yes, gosh, we'd love to do that. Yes, absolutely. I don't know we'll ever get enough money for that, but we would love to do that. I think doing the children of the cohort would be very, you get some great data from that. That would be lovely if we could do that. But I think, yes, I'm not sure that we'd get the money to do that yet. And the complications, it's very complicated. The complications of that would be interesting. And also there are lots of ethical issues about that. We'd have to think through the ethics of it, knowing what we know about the study, the cohort members. So yes, but that would be wonderful if we could get money to do that and ethical clearance to do that. I think that could be very good, great findings could come out of that.
I'm sure, because we talk about horizontal and vertical transmission, cultural transmission of ideas, that would be really great. I mean, to try. I know there's a lot of ethical issues, but sometimes you need to try to find new ways to better test intergenerational effects, because people often over or underestimate them, and making it intergenerational is really something that could broaden up the field.
One of the things I was just saying about the analysis that we've just been doing and just publishing on now about the experience of early trauma, and that's around different forms of trauma. We don't have an ACEs measure. But we've got various aspects. We've got measures that cover the sort of key aspects of the ACEs measure, but they're not exact replicas of it. But things like early history of sexual abuse or violence within families, etc. And that is very strongly linked to involvement in serious offending in later years, along with poverty and early history of institutional contact, things like school exclusion, early involvement with the juvenile justice system. But that trauma, it makes me wonder, and also adult trauma, not to forget adult trauma. So trauma in the adult years is also significantly linked to offending in the adult years. So things that happen to you in the adult years. And there is not an exact correlation, not a really strong correlation between early trauma and adult trauma, because of course it's context specific probably. But thinking through about how people are talking about relationships in their 30s and the preciousness of it. And yet the early history of some of these people has been very, very traumatized and traumatic. It's as if, and of course, we don't know absolutely how they're parenting their children, but what they're seeing is almost a reaction to their own early experiences, and that preciousness and the importance of their relationships and their children, how much they love them, that there's a sense of them not wanting to be like the way in which they were parented. That's kind of a strong impression that comes through. So I think that it's a bit interesting. It's a sort of as if the reaction to the intergenerational thing, it's not necessarily, it may act in, it may function in a different kind of way. It may not just be that you've got a bad dad and a bad mum and you've got bad children. It may be that having had a very difficult childhood has actually flipped, and it makes them as adults want to actually be more nurturing of their children because they're in a context where they can be more nurturing of their children. I don't know. We'd have to. There's not enough evidence for that, but that the qualitative data would be suggesting that it might function in a slightly different way. I don't know. We need more data.
In other disciplines, people talk about the intergenerational effects of trauma. So. And it makes sense. I mean, also epigenetical effects.
Yeah.
So this is really something that is worth researching. And I hope that, contemporary longitudinal studies will, in the end, have this intergenerational transmission. But of course, we will need to convince policymakers and those who want to invest in this kind of research.
Yeah.
Perhaps we could go a little bit back to Scotland. And
yes,
and the institutionalization of criminology in Scotland.
Yeah.
Perhaps how is criminology taught in your university?
Okay, how's it taught? Right. So we have there are 19 institutions of higher education in Scotland, which is quite a lot for a small jurisdiction, and quite a lot of them run criminology programs in some measure. Many of the big universities run master's programs, so master's program, PhD programs. There are some undergraduate programs. Edinburgh doesn't yet have an undergraduate program, but Glasgow teaches it at undergraduate level, and so does Stirling, Napier, many of the others teach it at undergraduate level. So it is. I think undergraduate criminology has absolutely burgeoned across the UK in the last 10 years. Big classes, people are desperately wanting to study it, which is in a way lovely. I think last time when we were being interviewed, we had our interview, we were talking about, what the value and what the risks and the values are of having undergraduate generalist criminology degrees as opposed to more specialist degrees at master's level. But certainly there's a huge enthusiasm for it. So it is burgeoning as an area of academic study in Scotland. I suppose we ought to be pleased that the field is so popular. People want to do it. And I think the Scottish Crime and Justice Research Centre has really helped to build the doctoral community as well. That has really helped build capacity there. And we've got some wonderful training for doctoral candidates there that they run. So that's all been really very positive. So I think in many ways the future is very rosy. I think universities across the UK are suffering funding crisis, and there's a bit of a crisis emerging in higher education, but I think criminology may not be necessarily feeling the effects of that yet. I think the arts and humanities are a bit more under threat than, say, social sciences, particularly criminology. But I mean, universities have fewer international students coming, governments are not investing enough in universities, and so there is a bit of a funding crisis coming for universities, and that may or may make it difficult to in the future.
So you mentioned 19 universities.
Yes, yeah.
And there's an interesting phenomenon there, because let's say Great Britain is supposed to be the model of capitalism or market economy, whatever you call it. But but your institutions are mainly public institutions. And if you go to Spain, for example, which is supposed to be a much more a country much more influenced by the presence of the state, and people get public jobs, and that you have a phenomenon of multiplication of private universities. This is also seen in South America. Do you have this phenomenon of private universities in Scotland?
Yes. Not so much in Scotland, but in England there are private universities like Buckingham University, and there's also a law university in London, which I can't remember the name of, that is a private university. So we do have that, but I wouldn't say it's not massive and it's not overtaking the market, so to speak. So it's not necessarily that. And when I talk about these institutions in Scotland, some of them are, like the Glasgow School of Art, and there's University of the Highland Islands, and sort of quite smaller universities as well as the Open University in Scotland. The Open University also has a branch in Scotland too. So it's quite surprising that there seem to be so many in such a small jurisdiction. But university education in Scotland, there are no tuition fees for Scottish students. So whereas in England, they have to pay tuition fees. So although they have to pay living expenses, and there are obviously bursaries for students from poorer backgrounds, that Scotland still doesn't have to pay tuition fees. That's a massive difference. So young people are not ending up with massive debt when they come out of university, as they are in England and Wales. They're coming out with debt of like £60,000, whereas in Scotland they're not. That £9,500 a year is not. They don't have to pay, which is part of the reason why it's also possible. That's why there's such a dependency on foreign students or sort of international students coming with international fees across the UK as a whole, because the £9,500 tuition fee doesn't cover the costs of tuition. And in Scotland, you're getting funded places from the government, but again, instead of getting those fees for those Scottish undergraduates, but we get, it's still not enough. So there's a need for international students, and that's dropped. Partly also because of the Westminster government and its attitudes to people who might want to migrate to the UK, and it's really terrible, unfriendly, hostile environment that it's trying to create at the moment with this Conservative government. It's possibly in its death throes at the moment. I'm not sure. Hopefully that we'll have an election quite soon. Yeah.
Does that mean that a student from England that goes to Scotland has to pay a tuition fee?
Yeah. Yes. Yeah.
How do you define a Scottish? Yeah, Scottish is that they live in Scotland, that they were born in Scotland? Domiciled in
Scotland. If they're living in Scotland, they don't pay the tuition fees. If you're Scottish, and actually, to be honest, I'm absolutely not sure about the case where somebody is born in Scotland and goes to live in France, comes back to Scotland, whether they can claim free tuition. I don't know. Possibly, yes. But it's generally who's domiciled in Scotland. And so the rest of the UK, so Northern Ireland, Wales and England would pay fees. They would pay the fees. And if Scottish students go to an English university, so domiciled Scottish student goes to an English university, the Scottish government pays the fee to the English university. So that it's not that they have to pay. So so they have that. That is one really great benefit that Scotland has, along with some other things that devolution has given us, like free prescriptions, and other things that are not the same in England. That's the benefit.
But someone could change domicile and go to the country, establish herself of himself there and then claim
Yeah,
the.
I suppose so, but I don't think that really happens very much. I don't think people are deliberately doing it. Yeah, no. But I think you would, yes, if you moved up to Scotland and you lived in Scotland and you went to high school in Scotland, you would not have to pay fees.
I was just thinking how this works from an empirical point of view.
Yeah,
because
it
probably is not that you arrive today, you say, now I'm living in Scotland, I want
no.
There must be some
Yeah.
But that is very interesting. So you have the three levels: bachelor's, master's, PhDs in criminology.
Yes, we do. Yes, all three levels. Yeah.
But because the PhDs in criminology, there must be relatively new, huh?
No, not really. No, we've really since the 70s there have been PhDs in criminology. In Edinburgh, there would have been students who were taking, we had the Centre for Criminology in the study, what it was called, the Centre for Criminology in the study of social and philosophical study of law, or as the lawyers used to call us, cesspool. That's what the nickname for us. That actually began in the 80s, to be fair, but there was a criminology department before that. And with the establishment of the chair in the 70s, that students would be coming through with PhDs from that time on. David Garland got his PhD at Edinburgh University. He's one of our best known, I know. So he was
because in many countries you can, for example, in Spain, you will get a degree, a PhD in law, let's say.
Yeah.
Well, subfield, and the subject is a criminological subject.
I see.
So that is not the case. You already had this.
Well, I suppose, to be fair, what they'd just be, for the University of Edinburgh doesn't call its PhD, a law PhD or a criminology PhD. It's just called a PhD. That's the degree. So, and then what you do is in the graduation, you have the title of your PhD underneath when you graduated. So they used to publish that. So it would be but people were doing criminological subjects as for a PhD a long time ago.
That is a much better solution. Eh?
Yes.
So you have a PhD, that's all,
That's it.
And then you will not have because there's a pleonasm, you have a PhD in philosophy, for example.
Yeah.
You're a philosophy doctor in philosophy, then you avoid this problem. Because in what I've seen, for example, in Spain, is some discussion about the people who now got a criminology degree, and they say that the other ones who do not have but they couldn't have a criminology degree, should not call themselves criminologists. With that logic, most of the founders of criminology would not be criminologists. But then you don't have this this problem. So we talk about research, but maybe one more thing about teaching is we talk about interdisciplinarity, but how is it applied? Because I was in this conference a couple of months ago in Brazil. It was comparison of criminology programs in Europe. That was mainly Portugal and Spain. There was Rosemary Barbaret from the US, and then in South America. And I realized that, for example, the American programs, or let's say the programs of the USA, because America is a continent, they have a lot of non-specific branches, so you do your studies, but you have, not everything is related mainly to criminology. You have very large topics that are also studied.
Yeah. Well,
how is it in Scotland?
Well, we don't actually have an undergraduate, so I would be able to comment on what Edinburgh does, but I think that quite a lot. So I think many of the Scottish degrees, so the honours degrees in Scotland are 4-year degrees, and in the first 2 years you will take your main subject area, but you'll also do outside subjects as well. So that might give it a sense of a more general or less specialist. So for example, in Edinburgh, you can, if you're doing a sociology degree, you have to do sociology 1, but you can also do an outside subject. So you might choose criminology as one of your outside subjects, and you would add on something else as well. And so you'd have 120 credits in your first year, made up probably of 3 blocks of subject area, maybe 2 courses within each. And criminology could be part of that. So often you'll do in a Scottish degree, you'll do 2 years where you will also do other subjects. Glasgow University, for example, makes students take enough subjects so that you could actually do a joint degree or switch degrees after 2 years. So they allow them to do more subject areas in that way, so that they can they can take a different specialism if they want. Many of the criminology degrees are, what I do worry about a criminology degree is often it's quite generalist, or it's not in depth in certain terms of like deeply into sociology or deeply into history or deeply into psychology, but it kind of cuts across and does lots of things. And in the past, when people became criminologists, it's often the case that they came from a disciplinary perspective into interdisciplinarity in your master's or your PhD stage, so that you might have people who had, politics degree or degrees in political science, like I do. I majored in political philosophy, but sort of politics degree, and then coming into criminology later, or although I had a slightly odd route then, not through doing a degree, but through teaching, and then working in government. Or you might do a sort of sociology degree or social policy or social work or psychology, and then you get depth in the primary discipline, and you bring that depth into learning at a master's level, other bits of criminology. So you're bringing a deep specialism in a particular degree into an interdisciplinary context, whereas I think criminology degrees tend to be quite interdisciplinary to begin with, and a bit more generalist. And I don't know, I think it'd be interesting to see how the discipline develops with people who are coming from those backgrounds, who are coming in to be academics now, and then who in the next 10 years will become then the professors of criminology, and how the discipline looks with that kind of educational background. Maybe it doesn't matter, but I think it's an interesting thing.
And if we talk a little bit, there's something that you mentioned about research that I was wondering. You mentioned that critical criminology was very prominent, also had an influence on research by the government. So I was wondering, on the one hand, was there other paradigms were also strong at that time? And also, which was the relationship? I know that the Home Office Research Unit is something that is in England and you're in Scotland, but they were doing research at the time. The autonomy of Scotland was not as big as it is now. And as we had an interview with Pat Mayhew, which is not yet online, I was wondering, because the two visions are quite different. Was there any interaction?
Yes, there was actually, because we all went down to Sunningdale for training. So we would meet up. So Sunningdale was a civil service training college near London. And so we'd all come down, because we were employed by the civil service, even though we were in the Scottish office. So we would all trot down, and it would all be sort of the criminology folk or people who were involved. So I was in social work services group, but I did criminal justice social work. So there'd be counterparts who would be there for this training. So we would meet them, and they were really, it was actually very interesting, good fun, and also really interesting meeting them and hearing. So George Mayer, who was who left the Home Office to become a professor of criminology, he was very senior in the Home Office when Susan McVie and I were juniors, and we go along to these training sessions, and George Mayer would come in very dapper, very, very well dressed, lovely suits and two-tone shoes, and looked very sophisticated. And there was us oiks coming down from Scotland, the tartan oiks, to learn up. But it was good meeting him. Actually, we were very impressed with what we were taught, and those were good occasions. So yes, there was interaction. We did speak a lot to each other, a lot. So. And of course, the British Society of Criminology and its conferences, the Central Research Unit often used to go to those. So, and you'd meet people there. There was yes, it was interesting times.
Yeah. And there were some Scottish people working at the research unit. I remember Gordon Barclay, who was with the international relationships. So there was, but. And
George Mayer was Scottish too, actually. Now that I think about it. So yes, there was interaction. Yeah.
And you think their approach had an influence also on criminology in Scotland, a more situational approach? to crime?
Yes, I think I think the Clark and Cornish work was hugely influential. I mean, that's something that you wouldn't imagine happening now, that somebody who was working in government as an analyst would have such a groundbreaking work that had such disciplinary import. So yes, it did. Yes, absolutely, that did. Yes. That's always held up as a kind of example. And it's an example of in-house sponsored research that's really important. And it did have an effect in policy, but it was also important in disciplinary terms as well.
Okay, great. So I think we have talked about the influence on criminal policy. We talk about the challenges because you mentioned them, but there are two questions, let's say closing questions that we like to ask our host. And one is how crime has changed in Scotland during your lifetime, or let's say the time that you've been doing research. You mentioned a couple of things about that, but do you have a general idea of what has changed?
I think in terms of trends, I think that we have seen a massive reduction in crime, so to speak, in terms of recorded crimes gone down massively, about 57% over the last 20 years or so. The crime survey, so victimisation survey, is also demonstrating a similar drop, around about 47% reduction over time. In the recorded crime statistics, violence and sexual crimes, non-sexual crimes of violence and sexual crimes have gone up slightly recently. So that's in the recorded crime, but that's not necessarily reflected completely in the crime survey data. So there is a sense that there has been a reduction in crime, and I think a reduction in violence. I think there are some concerns now that some of those trends might reverse. There are some big concerns about violence in schools in Scotland at the moment, and there needs to be a bit more systematic research as to whether that actually is the case or not. But there's a kind of sense of the perception that violence might be increasing in there. And also there are hotspots of violence, of course, across Scotland. But generally speaking, I think Scotland has exhibited this crime drop. So I think that's interesting. I think the prison rates, Scotland's always considered to be have high prison rates, and it's certainly true that in a European context we're kind of sort of above the average and a little bit above England, not massively so, but a little bit above England. And that's always been a bit of a conundrum, because we've had many much more welfarist or approaches to juvenile justice and sometimes even in adult justice, and see ourselves as distinctive because of the importance of social work in adult justice, as distinctive from England and Wales often, except maybe in this short period of this punitive period just post-devolution. That the conundrum is, why is it we have such high imprisonment rates? And as I think I said last time that one of my wonderful ex-PhD students, Louise Brangan, who's now working at Strathclyde University, one of their Chancellor's Fellows. It's great to see how well she's doing. She's a wonderful researcher. I mean, she's sort of saying, well, why are you talking about Scottish exceptionalism, Leslie? Because actually imprisonment rates suggest we're really punitive. So I would argue, contra this, that perhaps the prison imprisonment rates are possibly, for adults, is possibly the thing that is the exceptional thing, a non-exceptional thing about Scotland. But for nearly everything else, we're exceptionally low and different from other places. But imprisonment rates have gradually sort of grew right through up to about the 2010s. And then they've been sort of interesting after that, a bit more stable. But there's been an uptick recently. And at the moment this year, though I haven't seen the most recent figures, which have not yet been published, there is a real concern about massive overcrowding in Scottish prisons and the adult male population. And there is a crisis emerging within the prisons about they can't cope with it. The Barlinnie prison, the Bar L, which is a very notorious prison near Glasgow, where the Barlinnie Special Unit was, that has been due to close and a new prison built, and that's been delayed, and therefore that prison is, the circumstances in that prison are really shocking, actually, very shocking. So the prison population is a significant problem, but part of that has been driven, not so much, it's been driven really by, first of all, the remand population has gone up massively. So people on remand, huge rise, about 144% rise in remand over the last 6 years. So that remand population, and only about 45% of that remand population ever transition into a prison sentence. So there's too many people being put on remand. So I think there needs to be some look at sentences in all of this. And the other thing is that the length of sentences has increased over time. So there are more life sentences, more over 4 to 10 year sentences, more over 10 year sentences. So there's been a length, even though there's been legislation to stop short-term sentences of less than to prevent short-term sentences less than 12 months, the long-term population has grown over time. And that's one of the contributing factors to this high rate. And as I said, the remand population is a particular issue. And both of those factors are things that the judiciary could do something about. And I think, although we have a sentencing council now in Scotland, and although imprisonment for very young people is very low, I mean, hardly anybody now in prison under the age of 18, and there have been special sentencing guidelines for under 25s, which are very, very positive development. The sentences are still sending people to prison a lot and for longer terms, and that's not helping on remand or to prison, sentencing on to prison for longer terms, or placing people on remand either pre-conviction or post-conviction, and only 45% make a transition into prison. So there's something wrong there. That needs to change. The other thing that changed for people who are on life sentences, that some time ago in the early 2000s, the law was changed to make sure that sentences designated a punishment part to a sentence. So before that, you just, if you murdered somebody and you were convicted of it, you would be sent to prison for life, and it was sort of indeterminate when you would get out, and you'd come before the parole board. They would make recommendations to the Secretary of State for Scotland, and that usually occurred between around about 8 years into the sentence. And when I did my research on parole as my PhD in the early 1990s, around about 11 years was the most common period in which people might be in prison before they were then released into the community on licence for life. But now with this legislation, sentences have to designate a punishment part which has to be served before people can then be released or considered for release. And when sentences are judging, when they're making a sentence, they're not going to say, well, you're just going to serve 11 years. It's some of these, they'll say, oh, the punishment part is 15 or 20 years. And that's led, paradoxically, to more people spending time longer in prison. So the average sentence from the most recent figures that I've been able to get hold of around in 2018 is actually 18 years. So the length of time that life sentence prisoners are spending in prison is longer. And it's a paradox that this law was brought in because an indeterminate sentence was seen to be breaching the human rights of prisoners, and yet it's actually led to longer sentences. So that's also contributed to the prison population a little bit. They're not a massive population within the prison population, but it has contributed to high rates.
Yeah, that's a major point, because I mean, you can reduce the short-term sentences, but in the stock, they don't represent a lot of people are sentenced every year, but this is the flow, and as they're short, you don't see them. But the stock, if you have this phenomenon that you studied already in your PhD, at that time you said it was 11 years, the length, and now it's 18.
It's now 18, yes. On average, it was 11 when I did my PhD, my sample. And they were first considered for release at around about 8 years in. Whereas now, if you have a designated part, you're not allowed to be considered for release until you serve that point. That's the punishment part of it. So I think that has added to the prison population because of the length of time that people are in prison. And
that's a very difficult idea to pass for the public opinion. Unless, for example, you show you would have to see what happened to these people that were liberated after 11 years or 8 years, and then show, I don't know the result, but if the recidivism rate is low, then you can show with some data, because otherwise nowadays it would be very difficult to say we're going to reduce the length.
I think when I was doing my research on parole, this is actually as part of this is interesting. I did it as a government research project because I was managing a project on criminal justice social work and looking at the impact of ring fence funding for a lot of for things like prison social work and what the effect of that was on decision making and success in things like probation or parole licenses. I was allowed to use some of the data that I'd collected for that bigger project for my PhD, and what we found there was that the parole board were much less, the ones I interviewed were much less worried about life sentence prisoners than they were about the sort of 4 to 10 year sentence for violence. For those people, the violent offenders between 4 to 10 years were the ones that they tended to get recalled to custody, and they were worried about. They were less worried about the lifers, partly because of the nature of the way in which they had to progress through regime to be able to be considered, to actually be likely to be considered for release. And how often for them they were describing it as being one-offs or particular contexts or issues with drugs and alcohol that they had had time within prison to address, although they also acknowledged that you couldn't always address something. A problem with alcohol is difficult to address and to put you in a real life situation where you might be at risk of taking alcohol. But they did feel much more confident about their lifers and releasing them than they did with these sort of slightly shorter term, but actually violent offenders, with some exceptions. Obviously, there were cases in the life sentence population that were extremely difficult and extremely, people who were extremely dangerous for others. So that, it didn't happen in every single case that they were let out at 11 years. So that and it was interesting looking at the recall population in Scotland and how and who's in it. And I think sometimes what the general public don't understand is if you're on life license, you're on license till the end of your life. So that if you do anything in the community that causes concern, you can be taken back into prison. And I think that's something that's really not understood. And so even when being released on license, there are conditions attached. If that is well monitored and managed, that ought to give the public confidence, but it's not always understood.
Yeah. And one interesting thing that you mentioned, overcrowding, And
yeah.
Of course, you know this, but I'm not sure that people following the podcast know it. Scotland uses the sign capacity of the institutions to estimate the overcrowding. So if the institution was created for 100 prisoners, if you have 102, there's overcrowding. But England and Wales, they use operational capacity, which means that the governor of the prison decides at one moment which is the capacity. And so I discussed with them a couple of times. The new prisons have like 3 beds. And so when you have one person in the cell, it's good. Then you can put down the second bed and then still good because you're not overcrowded. And then you can put the third one. And then when you arrive to these levels, then you're having a problem. But if you look at the Council of Europe Penal Statistics, the space data, England is never overcrowded. It's always 99.8, it's always at the limit. And Scotland is systematically overcrowded. Yeah. And this does not reflect reality completely,
The prisons in England are an absolute mess at the moment. There's a massive crisis in the prisons, actually right across the UK, particularly in England, though. And the reports from the most recent reports from the Inspector of Prisons, Charlie Taylor, been excoriating about conditions, for example, in Bedford prison, rats, dirt, appalling conditions and overcrowded. So whatever they're using for their metrics do not at all match the reality of the prison experience. And there's a massive crisis, and it needs to be resolved because there will be violence and self-harm, and more violence and self-harm in prisons if they don't do something about it. So yes, they may measure it slightly differently, but they're in crisis too.
Exactly. Yeah. Maybe one small thing, because about prisons, what about the socio-demographic composition of the prison population? Because, for example, in Switzerland, we have 70% of prisoners who are non-Swiss citizens,
Right.
And this creates a lot of discussions and interpretations that are quite, I wouldn't say dangerous, but complicated.
So, are they being held there because they're going to be removed, they're illegals, or are they being held there because they've been convicted of something?
So now we have better studies, because many of the people working at the statistical office are former students of Lausanne, so we are proud of that. So they make the distinction about, because Switzerland has a high percentage of foreign people living legally in the country. It's almost 1/4 of the population. And if you go to the big cities like Lausanne, you will have 1/3 of the population who are non-Swiss citizens, or non-Swiss, not born in Switzerland. In Geneva, you can have 50. So you have to take this into account. When you take this into account, the percentage of foreigners legally established in Switzerland is more or less the same that you find in prison. Maybe there's a slight difference. But we have a lot of people. Switzerland is a small country in the middle of Europe, so many people cross the country. So the main part are persons who are not established, because there is this confusion about immigrants and foreigners, you know. An immigrant is one concept, a foreigner is a different one. And the problem comes with, let's say, foreigners who are not living in Switzerland, but maybe they are not even illegally residing, but that enter the country. Sometimes it's very easy. You've been here, so you are in Lausanne. You take your car, and in 1 hour, less than 1 hour, you are in France, in 40 minutes. You know. So that is one of the problems that we are facing now, and it's difficult to explain to the population.
So I think most of the Scottish population, prison population, are Scottish, and in fact 94% of the population is white. So that says something. But and actually, when you look at the statistics, talking about, well, if you designate it as foreign, whatever that might mean, when you see statistics published about foreigners, it's micro level, like less than 1%, way less than 1% of the population equates with that if you look at some of the statistics that are published. But this is partly also because of the nature of the way in which the sort of custodial estates work. So migration and asylum are not devolved topics. So they're what are called reserved. They're reserved areas of policy that are reserved to Westminster. So, and also interestingly, so this is another aside, drugs policy is also a reserved thing. We don't have control over the drugs policy. So Westminster has control over that, and the Home Office is the main driver in terms of policy here. And in Scotland, we have one institution, Dungavel, which used to be a prison, but is now a detention centre for people who are either to be processed for potential asylum claims, or for people who are going to be removed, but are there, they're pending removal. So there's one place for that. So they're not in the mainstream. These people are not in the mainstream prison system, really. They shouldn't be in the mainstream. That's where they would be. And the jurisdiction is not Scotland. The jurisdiction is the United Kingdom. So it's a slightly different situation. But interesting, when you look at the Scottish prison population in more detail, so although 94% of it is white Scottish, when you look at the different other ethnic groups and minoritized ethnic groups that are within the population, as a rate per population, people from an African and Caribbean background, the rate of population is much higher than it is for white Scottish, even though the numbers are actually much higher, if you see what I mean. So there is an interesting disparity there. And we know from in England and Wales particularly, when we look at juvenile justice statistics, that young people from minoritized ethnic communities are significantly more likely to be drawn into the juvenile justice system and to end up in prison than other ethnic groups. And it can't be accounted for by their differential involvement in offending behaviour. There is actually some degree of bias within the system. And it's interesting that in Scotland, there is this elevated rate per population amongst certain ethnic groups. And I think that would be worthy of further investigation, although the numbers themselves are actually quite low because the majority of people in prison are white Scottish.
Yeah, thank you very much. It's a major topic nowadays. But of course, yeah, the fact that you're not in the continent also changes completely the relationship with the neighboring countries.
Yeah.
So I think we cover all the topics we wanted to cover and more. And so we would like to thank you, Leslie, for having joined us. We will explain at the beginning of the podcast that this is a re-recording, a new interview.
A second go.
Yeah, exactly.
A second coming.
Exactly. Because unfortunately, the first one, most of the for technical reasons, most of the interview disappear. But I think this one is better because we are
better prepared now. Yeah, of course.
Well, thank you very much. It's been lovely speaking to you, and thanks. It's been fun.
You.
And I hope to see you both in Bucharest.
Okay.
Yeah.
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 Thanks a lot.
Thank you very much.
Pleasure. Take care.
You.
See you soon. Bye-bye. Bye.
Bye-bye.
Thank you for following Lieven and Marcelo's Criminology podcast. This podcast is edited by Eduardo Coco from the University of Lausanne. Our theme song is Seagull's Night, Noche de Gaviotas, composed by Gustavo Cantero, arranged by Tato Germano, and played by Tato and Gustavo with the voices of Sasha Conte and Alejandro Turco Gujot. Your hosts are Lieven Pauwels from Ghent University, Belgium, and Marcelo Evi from the University of Lausanne, Switzerland. Cheers, and see you soon.